Now in this lesson we're going to return to our theory again, and we're going to learn the theory of major scales and intervals. So first off we have to learn about intervals. The most basic intervals are called the half step and the whole step, or in classical music the semitone and the tone, but in guitar speak we're going to call them the half step and the whole step. It's quite simple really. If we have this note here, a G, then the next note is a G sharp, the interval between G and G sharp is a half step. So that's just a half step as one fret on the guitar. In the same way, the interval between G and F sharp, or G and G flat, is also a half step. A half step is just a one fret interval or gap. A whole step is just two frets, so the interval between G and A is a whole step, or G and F. So a whole step is two frets and a half step is one fret. Nice and easy. Now we'll just do a little bit more about music. Now in music we have 12 notes altogether, divided between 7 letters. The letters are A, B, C, D, E, F and G as we know, and we've got a myriad of sharps and flats in the middle there. So there's a couple of rules. The interval between B and C is always a half step. So if we have a B note here, then the interval to a C is always a half step. So C is always one fret higher than B, whereas any other note, like for an A to a B, is 2 frets. And that same rule applies between E and F as well. The interval between E and F is always a half step. So if we have an E here to an F, it's a half step. E to F is a half step. So between B and C and E and F, it's always half steps there. So now that we know that, we can actually start to write out all our notes. So let's start on a C and write down all our 12 notes in order. So the first note is a C, the next note is a C sharp or a D flat, next note is a D, next note is a D sharp or a D flat, or E flat, sorry. The next note is an E. Now we know the interval between E and F is always a half step, so the next note is an F, the next note is an F sharp or a G flat, the next note is a G, the next note is a G sharp or an A flat, the next note is an A, the next note is either an A sharp or a B flat, and the next note is B, and that's our 12 notes. But we want to go full circle back to D again, so back to C again, so we'll go back to C now. Now, of course, the rule between B and C is it's always a half step, so we know the C is just there, and that's our 12 notes. And see, we've gone one full octave higher. So music is divided into octaves. So you might have a note way up here compared to a note way down there, but the difference between those two is that one is 3 octaves higher than the other. So that's how our notes work. We have 12 notes in music divided up in between the half steps, a half step between every note, but the rules are that between B and C we always have a half step, and between E and F we always have a half step, whereas between the other notes would be a whole step. That's excluding the sharps and flats. So try and write them out for yourself now. C, C sharp D, D sharp E, F, F sharp G, G sharp A sharp B, and then C. So a little bit of work. Grab a pen and paper and try it that way yourself. Try and write them all out as you can go, and try and memorize them as well. Now that we have a good knowledge of our notes, as well as our intervals being the half step and the whole step, what we can do is we can start to create major scales. So the first thing we have to learn is a major scale formula. So the major scale formula is WWH, WWWH, which is where the W means a whole step and H means a half step. It's whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So remember that formula. Now let's create a major scale. We'll do it in the key of C, so we'll create a C major scale. So let's start off and write out our 12 notes in music, starting on C. So it starts off with a C, the next note is C sharp, then D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp A sharp B, and then the last note is the 13th note, which goes full circle back to C again, and that's all our notes. Now what we do is we take our major scale formula, the one from earlier, and we apply it to those notes. So let's put it underneath and let's start to work it out. So C is our first note, and then the formula tells us to the next note is a whole step, or W. So C, and the next note after that is a D. And then we take the next note of the formula, which is another W, and D goes to E. And then the next note after that is a half step, so E goes to F. The next note after that is a whole step, so F to G. And then after that is another whole step, so G to A. And then another whole step from A to B. And then the last note of the formula, WWH, WWWH, is a H for half step, so it goes from B to C. So now that we've applied our formula to our 13 notes, we can extract the notes that the intervals point to. So the notes they point to is C, D, E, F, G, A, B and C. And that's our notes of the C major scale. So do you understand how we did that? We wrote out all the 12 notes and then the 13th note, of course. Then we applied our major scale formula to it and we took the notes that the interval said to take. So let's do the same thing in G now. We'll start off and write out our 12 notes starting from G. So it goes G, G sharp A sharp B, C, C sharp D, D sharp E, F, F sharp and G. So that's our 12 notes, and the 13th note is G, of course. And then we apply our major scale formula to it. So we'll apply the WWH, WWWH to it. So let's take out our notes now. So the first note is G, and then it's a whole step to the next note, which is A. Then it's a whole step to the next note, which is B. Then it's a half step to C. Then a whole step to D. Then a whole step to E. Then another whole step after that, which takes us to F sharp, and then G again. So we now know, if we take the notes that the intervals point to, we now know that the notes of a G major scale are G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G. So you see how we did that? We'll do one more just for practice. Let's do a D major scale. So first thing we do is we write down our 12 notes. It might be worth doing on paper, by the way, so if you have a pen handy then certainly write in your book or else write on paper and just practice it yourself. But anyway, let's do it on as well now. So we start off with our 12 notes, which is D, D sharp E, F, F sharp G, G sharp A sharp B, C, C sharp and then D again. So let's apply our formula now. The WWH, WWWH. So D to E is a whole step. And then E to F sharp is a whole step. F sharp to G is a half step. G to A is a whole step. A to B is a whole step. And then B, we have to do a whole step after that. So it takes us to C sharp. And then we have a D. So let's look at the notes that the intervals point to. They've got D, and then straight up to E, then off to F sharp, then up to G, then up to A, then up to B, then up to C sharp, and then finally D. So that's the notes of a D major scale. D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, and D. So we now know how to create major scales. What I would suggest you do now is try and create a major scale in the key of A, and then try one in E, and then try one in B, and then try one also in F. Now if you really get good, try doing a scale of B flat, or E flat, or A flat, and they're different scales as well. It's well worth the practice, and it won't take too much to get the hang of it. You just have to click onto the concept first. So, as a simple formula, you take your 12 notes in music, starting on the note, the major scale you want to create, and then you write down the formula, the WWH, WWWH, and then you apply the two together, and you come up with 7 notes, and the 8th note is repeated, of course. Now that we know how to create major scales, we're going to take those major scales and increase them a little bit and start to create what's called key signatures, which is where we're going to play all the chords in key for a certain key. So if we're playing in the key of C, then we know that the C major scale is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, but we don't know what chords to play. We can quite happily play C, and then a D chord, and then an E chord, and an F chord, etc. But some of them are out of key. So what we want to do is put those chords into key. So what we do is we apply a new formula now, which is major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, major. And we marry that up with the notes of the major scale. So for example, the first chord in the key of C is a C, of course, so we apply that and that becomes a major. So it stays as is. The second chord is a D. Now that says to do a minor, so we'll do a D minor. The third chord is an E, and that's also a minor. The fourth chord is F, which is a major. The fifth chord is a G, which is a major. The sixth chord is an A, which is a minor. The seventh chord is a B, which is diminished, so we do a B diminished. And the eighth chord is a C. So we do major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, and major. So you see how we're marrying up the chords to our new formula, or the notes of the scale to our new formula to create chords. So we end up with a major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, major. And that's what we use the major scales for. So if we're in the key of D, for example, we know the chords go D, E minor, F sharp minor, G major, A major, B minor, C sharp diminished, and then back to D again. And that's our chords in the key of D. Now you can do that with any of your major scales. Of course, we don't know how to play diminished chords, and I wouldn't worry too much about them because they don't get used anyway. They're quite horrible sounding chords to me, so they won't get used until the next session basically. But for the time being, you can just understand that now that you can work out the chords, you can start to work out songs. So I'll give you an example. If you wanted to start figuring out songs from the radio, and you were listening away and you got the first chord was a D, then most likely the next chord is going to be either one of those chords out of the key. So it's either going to be an E minor, F sharp minor, G, A, B minor, C sharp diminished, unlikely though, or D. So we get back and start playing these chords in key. So if you can get the key of the song, then you can figure out the rest of them. Now the most popular chords are the first, the fourth and the fifth. So if you can work out that a D is the first, D is 1, and then the fourth is going to be a G, and the fifth is going to be an A. So let's look at that with our major scale. We've got D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp and D. And we can see the fourth and the fifth chords along there are the ones that we're interested in, the first, fourth and the fifth. It's called a 1-4-5 progression, and thousands and thousands and thousands of songs, the majority of songs use 1-4-5 progressions in some way or the other. You've probably even seen music books around that have 10,000 songs for 3 chords. What they're talking about is a 1-4-5 progression. So most likely, if you're interested in any particular key, if you get the first chord, let's say a G, then most likely the next chord is either going to be a C or a D, being the 4 and the 5 of the key of G, or else somewhere in amongst those chords of G anyway, which is G, A minor, B minor, C, D, E minor, F sharp diminished, or G. So that's the chords of any particular key. So, do you understand all that? You work out your major scale, and then you apply the formula major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, major to that scale, and you have the chords of your key. And from there you can then figure out songs. You could even write your own songs. Let's take an example. Let's play a chord of G, and then we'll just pick a random chord. Let's play the number 3, which is the minor. So that's G, A, B, it's a B minor. And then let's play the fifth. The fifth is very popular, so we'll go to the D, and then the fourth. So what we've got there is we've got the 1, then we've got a 3 minor, so we've got the third chord along, which is the minor as we know from our formula, then we've got the fifth, and then we've got the fourth, which are both majors. We just pick them at random and see what it sounds like. So it sounds interesting anyway. Perhaps that's how you could write a song. You could just pick some chords at random and then see what you can do with them. Maybe work out a verse and a chorus. You could fingerpick it or strum it. You can do basically anything you like. Now that you know a little bit of theory, you can really start to get on with it. So do endeavour to learn this theory off by heart. Start to learn the major scales and learn which ones have sharps and which ones have flats and what they are. And then also learn the chords for the particular keys. Most importantly, learning what the 1, 4 and 5 is for any particular key.